Good afternoon. Thank you for being awake for this after having that big barbecue lunch that I'm sure is settling down nicely in your stomach and you're getting sleepy. You're in that meat coma. Today I'm going to talk to you guys about forms. And I think most of us can probably agree that forms suck, right? They're awful. They're incredibly tedious to create. As a user, they're pretty annoying to fill in, right? They're not terribly fun, and they're really frustrating to test, especially if you have like a really long form that you need to keep debugging over and over and over again and keep having to fill out all these fields. And for those of you who may not be back-end inclined, that are more front-end designers and developers, they require logic, which can sometimes be a little bit scary and a little bit daunting to try and tackle. So my hope for this session is that I can take you from the mindset of forms sucking to maybe realizing that they can suck, they don't have to suck, and they can certainly suck a lot less, okay? And I want you to come out of this realizing that forms can be easy to build, they can be predictable, they can be effortless for our users to use, and most of all, they can be accessible. So I'm going to be talking quite a bit about accessibility in this, and you'll get to hear some wonderful synthetic voices later. So really, it's all about how you look at forms. And my one true word of advice to you in working with forms is that when you're looking at a form, you're looking at this big, complicated beast with lots of moving parts, right? Even if it's a fairly simple form. We'll take that and break that down into smaller, easily tackleable challenges, things that you can do simply and that you can create reusable patterns from. So a lot of what I'll be showing you today, I'll be calling different patterns. Each project often has its own patterns, but these are things that I've seen consistently in all of the work that I've been doing over the last almost 20 years. So we'll talk about a lot of patterns in here, probably about 7 or 8, I think. And they all kind of mix and match together. So to start out, we'll do an easy thing. We'll start out with something simple that everybody has had to code at one point or another, a simple contact form. All right, so this is the contact form from webstandardsherpa.com, and we'll start with the simplest field on here. We have your name. So here we have an input with a type of text because it's just accepting normal text into it, right? And then we have this arbitrary text above it that is your name. Now, HTML being what it is and the input type of text being the default input type, we can actually lose that type equals text and just have it be input. And it will default to being a text field. So that's nice. It shortens it up a little bit. You could, if you're old school like me and you like the XHTML rigor and having trailing slashes and stuff like that, you could have a trailing slash on here. I'm trying to be modern, so I'm going to leave it off and do the HTML5 thing. So once we've got the input in place, we then have to deal with the your name text that's above it. Now, in order to connect that field to what is essentially the label for that field, we need to use, of course, a label element. But the label element in and of itself does not create a connection between these two elements. In order to do that, we need to use the for attribute. And the for attribute goes on the label, and it is an ID reference to the field it is meant to describe. Fairly simple. So here we see label for equals full name, and then the ID of the field itself is full underscore name. Now this should be pretty obvious to most of you in the room who've been working on the web for any minutes. Hopefully you're all doing this, but you'd be surprised how often I go into, especially large enterprises, where this is like revolutionary to them. But this is the most fundamental way we can make our forms accessible. And the other nice thing about this is that the way most browsers behave, when you click on the label, it actually brings focus to the field. So it creates an additional affordance for our users, which is pretty awesome. So in the form itself, there's also this concept of all of the fields in this form being required. So in order to do that in the HTML, we can use the required attribute on that field, which will then, for any HTML5 aware browser, ensure that that field is required before the form is submitted, with the exception of Safari. Safari knows that the field is required, but will not actually block the form being submitted because it's a liar, and that it does not actually support HTML5 validation as it says it does. But we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, everybody got pattern 1 down? Pretty easy, right? So taking pattern 1, we can build upon that for pattern 2, which is a label, a field, and a note. So here we have basically a carbon copy of the original code from pattern 1 that we're using now for this email field, right? So I've updated it so that it now has the name is email, the text of the label is your email, and then the for attribute is email and the ID reference is email. So now we've brought them into alignment, right? We've gotten those two things together. So now we have the ability in HTML5 to actually say, you know what? This field accepts email input. So if we were to put type of email on here, then any browser that uses HTML5 validation will actually enforce a valid email address or multiple valid email addresses. The email field can accept multiple emails separated by spaces. So with the type of email in place, we get affordances like this in terms of a virtual keyboard as well, where the @ symbol and the period are surfaced for our users so that they can more quickly type in their email addresses, which is super handy for them, right? And we get this on Android, we get this on Safari, BlackBerry, Windows Phone, all of these different devices with virtual keyboards all use this same concept. Now what's interesting about this is that you can use the email type and the field will still work in IE6. IE6 has no idea what HTML5 is, but browsers are instructed to ignore what they can't understand. This is part of what's called fault tolerance in the web, and it works in HTML and it works in CSS. So browsers ignore that type equals email, and what do? They fall back to an input type of text. So if you don't have an HTML5 aware browser, you still have a text input, right? Easy peasy. This is the basis of progressive enhancement, and starting to use these new HTML5 input types is a way to progressively enhance our pages. All right, so now let's tackle that note bit at the bottom, right? So we will only use your email address to respond to your message. Now that's pretty important, so I'd like to emphasize that using an emphasis element. Makes sense, right? But, okay, well, actually, we'll take a step back for a second. I probably want to style that in a particular way, different from other emphasis elements, so maybe I'll give it a class of note, right? But we need to find a way to actually connect that to the field itself. How do we do that? Well, the Accessible Rich Internet Application spec, or Aria, allows us to do that using the described by attribute. So we can say aria-described by, and that is an ID reference to one or more things that describe this particular element on the page. And it can be used for lots of things, not just inputs. So aria described by is equal to email-note, and then an ID of email-note on the note that corresponds to the email field. Easy peasy, simple stuff. And notice I'm using consistent naming structure here. Email, email, email note, so kind of reinforcing that. We'll talk a little bit about that in terms of structure stuff in a moment. But with all of this stuff in place, what we end up with is pretty special.
Your email, edit text required. We will only use your email address to respond to your message.
That's pretty cool, right? Gotta take that down just slightly. Scares you. We need your email. So that's pretty awesome, right? Like a very, very simple thing for us to do markup-wise created a great experience for somebody who's using a screen reader. And that was Chromebox, by the way, which is starting to kind of creep up in terms of usage by people in the last WebAIM survey because it's freely available from the Google Chrome team as an extension to Chrome. So that's pretty cool. And all of the examples that I'll be using here are from Chromebox. So that's aria described by. Makes sense, right? So once we have these two patterns, we can basically rinse and repeat throughout the rest of the form. Here we have a select box for the subject of this particular email. So whether it's somebody having a question or a comment or telling us about an article error or what have you, We've got the for attributes associating the label and the field together. And then we've got the select. Same thing happens for the text area. We've got message, message. And then we've got the button. So the button itself is kind of an interesting thing in that we can use an input type submit, which is kind of the traditional way that we've used buttons in the past. But it's not terribly flexible. And traditionally, it hadn't been very stylable either. There wasn't a lot that we could do with it. That's changed, thankfully. But I think that there's a slightly better way to manage buttons, which is to use the actual button element. It works exactly the same way, except it's an opening tag and a closing tag, which means you can put stuff inside it. So here, I just changed it from the input with a value of send my message to a button with content that is send my message. Now, the reason that I like buttons is that they can contain pretty much anything within reason. Obviously, you would not want to put another button inside of a button, a link inside of a button, or another form inside of a button, but you can pretty much put anything else. So if we looked at this particular example, which is surprisingly from an article I think I wrote in 2006, but because you could do this stuff back then, here we have you're choosing a plan, maybe from a hosting company or something like that, and you can have an H3 and a paragraph and all kinds of other stuff inside of a button, and it works. That's pretty awesome. So buttons are pretty neat and very, very flexible. All right, let's get back on track here. So that email thing was pretty awesome, right? So let's look a little bit at some of the other fancy HTML5 stuff that we have available to us. We have a URL field type. So if you just do type equals URL, a browser that is HTML5 aware that uses a virtual keyboard will provide a series of buttons that will help somebody more quickly input URL type information. And the browser, if it actually implements HTML5 validation, will validate that as an actual URL before allowing the form to be submitted to the backend, which is also pretty awesome. So one thing here we have the URL note piece as well. But one thing I want to point out here is that it's also using a placeholder. So here we have this kind of grayed out text inside of the URL field. In this case, this is being used for Web Standards Sherpa, which if you're not aware it's a site that was put together by the Web Standards Project where you can submit a project you worked on and get experts to actually evaluate that and provide you with valuable, actionable feedback about how you might be able to improve particular aspects of that site. It's kind of like free critique. It's in public, but it's free critique, which is pretty awesome. So we want to get people's URLs, and in some cases, maybe people want to point us at a specific element on the page. So we've got, you probably can't see it very well because of the contrast, but http://www.yoursite.com/specific page #anchor section, right? So we're saying you could even say a specific element on the page based on its ID that you want us to look at. So we provided all of that in here as a placeholder. And we can do that using the placeholder attribute. So the one thing that is definitely you should know about the placeholder attribute is that it's just that. It's supposed to be a suggestion of the type of information that you would enter into it. It is not meant as a label. I don't want to see any of you abusing this and making it be a label because it is not helpful for people. But it is very useful for somebody when they go to type into it. So what you saw here is that the placeholder was visible, and when somebody focused on the field, the placeholder still remains visible until they start to type. And then if they were to wipe out the content of that field again, the placeholder would come back. Okay, so it's there to help them know the type of content you're looking for, maybe the specific format that you're looking for in the case of maybe a phone number or something like that. And there's another example I'll show you of that a little bit later on when we get to the validation piece of this. Can you hold your question to the end, if you don't mind? You could scribble it in your notebook, and we'll deal with it at the end. I just want to make sure I get through everything. Another type that we have is tel, or telephone. So this is for having phone numbers. Now, the interesting thing to note here, there is no browser validation for phone numbers. And the reason is that phone numbers vary so widely internationally that there's really no sound way of doing that. And having any sort of rigor behind it. And generally it's, kind of if you're thinking from a best practices standpoint, it's best to kind of accept things very loosely and, from the user, and then, do whatever formatting you need to do on the back end, and just kind of be liberal in what you accept and then strict in how you store it. So that's okay. But what's nice about the tell field is, again, in that virtual keyboard context, somebody will end up with a keypad to enter in that phone number, which is pretty friggin' sweet. Because anyone who's had to enter their phone number by typing on those little tiny numbers at the top of the keyboard, they know how crappy that is. So tell gets us around that. We also have the ability to say, hey, we're expecting a numeric input here. So we can use the number field type. And again, this should generate the numeric keypad, and unfortunately doesn't everywhere. So there's a little trick that we need to do in Safari, which I'll show you in a minute. But this is an example of what the field actually functions like in Chrome. Many of the browsers give you this little spinner box on the side that you can increment up and down through the numbers, which is pretty nice. And they should validate for that being an actual number as well, if they are implementing the validation. So jumping down to the Safari issue, in order to get mobile Safari to give you that numeric keypad, you can use the pattern attribute to define, bless you, to define a regular expression that should be matched as being one or actually 0 or more digits in this case. And what that does is it actually forces mobile Safari to give that numeric keypad for entry. So what I love about all these HTML5 things is that they're helping us get rid of a lot of extra JavaScript. All these things that we were having to build and maintain stuff for in order to have these nice affordances for users, we're able to get rid of all of that and just let the browser handle it. We don't have to worry about that. We don't have to worry about generating that interface, upgrading it when the new browser version comes out. We don't have to worry about making it accessible because that should all be on the browser, which is pretty sweet. And it just starts, honestly, to get better as we get a little bit deeper into some of these other pieces of HTML5. That stuff was just kind of scratching the surface. So we have a native slider, right? So any Spinal Tap fans in the audience? This one goes up to 11, we'll notice. So here we have, you can set, this is a type of range, and the minimum is 0, the maximum is 11, of course. And the step, so the values that I'm willing to accept along that spectrum are in full single digits. So step is 1. So 0, 1, 2, 3, et cetera, et cetera. You can do it in halves, quarters, whatever you want your increments to be, which is pretty friggin' awesome. And we can actually apply those min and max values to the number field as well. It functions in very much the same way. It's just not a slider. Okay? And you can even do the step, same thing, and it'll adjust the spinner box, which is sweet. But what's really awesome, if any of you have ever had to deal with dates in HTML5 aware browsers are friggin' amazing. So if we just simply say type of date, right, we get that in Chrome. We get a really nice native date picker. And what's interesting is there's a couple of different ways that a user can actually interact with this. If you look closely, you can see there's a spinner box at the end, so they can actually step up and down in any of those sort of masked pieces of the field. But they can also use the calendar picker to go throughout, which is pretty badass. And on mobile, we get a multiple select slider thing to be able to choose a date, which again is pretty awesome. This makes it so much easier for somebody to fill out a form. I mean, has anyone here ever had to debug a JavaScript calendar? Yeah, it sucks. It's really awful. There's never a good one. And trying to actually use one in mobile, that really sucks. So in this case, it's all native, which is fantastic. Interestingly enough, we can use min and max here too. So if I enter a min and max for this, I've got a minimum of 2014, 9/10, and going through December 19th. When this comes up in Chrome, what you'll actually see is that 2014 is actually what's highlighted there, right? And what you can't see because of the contrast probably, but you'll be able to see in these slides up on SlideShare, is that from the 20th on in December, it's actually grayed out. So it's actually kind of boxing somebody into the min and max that you've provided, which again is pretty friggin' amazing, that we can just be declarative in our markup, and then the browser provides the interface for doing that, for making that a reality. Now, it's worth noting before I jump into time here, for browsers that don't support HTML5, you could either leave it being a text field, maybe with a placeholder or something like that, or some note as to the format of the date that you want, or you could see if the browser actually supports HTML5, and if it doesn't and you really want that calendar picker, you could load that in via JavaScript in a lazy loading fashion to provide it as a polyfill for those users. But in most cases, I always found the date to be a bit annoying, the date pickers. So I like just using the native one and telling people the format that I want it at. Or just adjusting the format on the back end, which is super easy in just about any back end language, converting strings to date. So we also have a time type. And as you can probably see here, it ends up with an hour and a minute piece and then an AM, PM. And in mobile devices, you could actually end up with the multiple selects in this instance as well for being able to choose a time. So that's pretty cool. But probably one of the biggest things that we've written JavaScript for, apart from all the calendar stuff, is predictive typing, right? That's something that exists on so many different sites. And with HTML5, we can actually do that natively. And we do that using the data list construct. And so you define a data list which contains a series of options, just like a select box does, and you give the data list an ID. In this case, the ID is states. And then you create a list attribute on the field that you want to associate it with, and that list attribute is an ID reference to the data list. Pretty simple, right? And what we end up with is this. That's pretty fantastic. No JavaScript involved. Right? So you have this drop down so that it can actually act sort of like a select, but it also does predictive typing. The one thing to note is that the way that it's currently implemented in all the browsers that implement this, it is not a fuzzy search. So just have that expectation. It is going to be an initialism search just like it is in the select. So just have that expectation in your mind. But the one interesting thing, if you did want to integrate this with some sort of dynamic options in that data list, you can update those via Ajax and they automatically feed into the field, which is pretty cool. So you could load in all your data list options asynchronously if it's a particularly large list. But I really like this construct for things like a state selector or a country selector, which just, it's an awful experience for everybody trying to use a select for that, right? It sucks. Because you never know what you're going to get, and you always end up on the United Kingdom, right? Always happens. Okay, so that's that piece. If you do kind of follow the old model of the select and want to have a value that's different from the displayed text, that is still supported in some browsers that implement the data list. What that ends up looking like may not be what you expect, though. So in the case of Alabama is kind of like a grayed out text on the right-hand side, and the actual value that I'm looking for is what is in the dark black text AL. So, just be aware of that as well. Now, I talked a little bit about browsers ignoring what they don't understand in terms of input types, but there's actually a really smart way that Jeremy Keith came up with for using data list in a progressively enhanced fashion. So instead of just falling back to an input, what is data list really doing? What is predictive typing for? It's for providing a select with a series of options, and then if it's something other than one of those options, you want them to fill that into a field, right? So Jeremy actually figured out a way to make this work. So you start out with your label element, and then you have a data list after the label element, and after the data list, you have your input that the data list is associated with. And then inside of the data list, you have the select. So you put a select element inside of the label or inside of the data list, and then after the select, if other, please specify. Now, what's genius about this is that if you are in a browser that doesn't support data list, you end up seeing this, which is exactly what we would want, right? Now, the reason this works is because of fault tolerance. So a browser that understands the HTML5 data list will look at this, and it knows that the data list element is only supposed to contain options. So it ignores anything that is not an option element inside of the data list element. So you see I've got the select grayed out and the if other, please specify grayed out. So this is what an HTML5 aware browser sees. And then an older browser that doesn't understand the data list ignores the data list but exposes what's inside of it. So it gets the label, the select, the if other, please specify, and then the final input. That's pretty awesome. So pretty smart stuff. And you could use the Aria labeled by to still associate that select element with the original label as well to add some additional accessibility stuff. Cool? You guys jazzed about HTML5 stuff? It's pretty neat, right? All right, so let's talk a little bit about organizing our forms, because this is always something that trips some people up. They don't know, should I divide it up, or is a paragraph the right thing to do, or should I use lists? I've seen heated battles in teams sometimes, like, I want to use a list. No, it's divs. No, you know, it doesn't really matter, honestly. It's what makes sense to you, and obviously you want to pick a standard in your team or just for yourself and stick with it. I personally like lists because when I look at a form, it's a list of questions, right? Unless it's a search form, in which case it's just one field and a button, in which case a paragraph or a div would be fine. But with it being a list, it'll actually read out the number to somebody who's using a screen reader, so it'll tell them how many list items there are, which gives them a sense of how long the form is, which they don't get from paragraphs, and they don't get from divs. So, and then people are like, oh, but if I use a list, I end up with bullets and stuff like that, or at least that's what they used to say. Really simple to remove all of that stuff, so we don't have to worry about it. But regardless of what you use as your containing element for your label and your input, I really like the idea of classifying those so that if I need to style a field in a particular way, I can use a class attribute on the container to style the field and the label rather than having to rely on an attribute selector. And the reason is that there are some of our clients that are still having to support things like BlackBerry 4 and Internet Explorer 6. Sounds really awful, right? But when you start getting into the mobile space, it happens. We had a client that we did some work for them, well, a lot of form work that was specifically geared towards iPad, iPhone, and Android. They came back to us 6 months later and they gave us a list of 1,400 different devices that accessed their mobile website that they wanted to support. Some of those were BlackBerry 4, some of them were OpenWave, and we were able to do it because we followed progressive enhancement and we were able to support them. They didn't have the exact same experience, but they still were able to do what they needed to do. In this case, it was log in. But using things like class selectors, which are fairly old school, allows us to have that same sort of design parity back to those really old early devices. Of course, if you're new school and you're into BEM, you can certainly do BEM classes, so block element modifier style classes on here. So we have a form control class, and then we have a modified version of that that is form control $text. So all form controls can share one particular set of style rules, and then text fields can get styled in another way. For the purpose of this presentation, I'll just stick to simple text or select or email. Whatever the type of field is inside of it is generally the class name that I will associate with it, just so that I have consistency for styling across the board. Okay? All of that makes sense? Text area, buttons, etc. All right. So let's get a little bit more complicated now. So here we have, not too complicated, but slightly more complicated. We have a confirmation checkbox. So sign me up for this newsletter. I do not know why me is capitalized in this. This was a screenshot from another site, but I lowercased it in the code, don't worry. So here we have text and we have a checkbox to associate with it. Well, we know we can do a label and then do a for attribute to associate it with it. But again, I am constantly thinking of older devices as well. And while I could use an attribute selector to do an input type of checkbox or an input type of radio for these sorts of input controls, that won't work in IE6 and below. It won't work in BlackBerry 4. It won't work in OpenWave. And I want to be able to give them at least a good experience. I don't want to have a checkbox that's 180 pixels wide, right? So for that reason, for checkboxes and for radios, I'm actually a big fan of using implicit labeling. So this is where you wrap the label element around the input and the text that you want to be the label. Now, the one downside of implicit labeling is that it does not create the same click connection in IE7 and below as the explicit labeling does. But the nice thing is you can certainly double them up. But what it allows you to do is do inputs styled one way and then inputs inside of labels styled another way. And that has much more universal support. And then I can double up the explicit labeling with the implicit labeling, and I still get the same accessibility and usability benefits of the label and the checkbox. And the nice thing is the label, if I click on it, it will check and uncheck the box for me as well. So it becomes a bigger hit target, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. All right, so, and then the whole thing would be wrapped inside of some constructor with a class of confirm or something to that effect. Pattern 4 builds on that as a multiple choice. In this case, this was a screenshot from the Chattanooga Open Device Lab. And this is from the reservation form. In the reservation form, you can choose which devices you want to have available to you when you come in to use the lab. So here are the tablets. So inside of that, we've got a checkbox. I realized after I made this slide that I forgot to put a value on that input. Just pretend it's there. Pretend it ran off the side of the screen. But anyway, so we have our implicit label with explicit 4 to ID association. So we're building off of pattern 3. But now we have to deal with it in kind of this larger context, right? We have tablets, 8 available to associate with it. Well, first of all of these items under tablets really are part of a list. So I would put them in their own list. In this case, an unordered list because they're not alphabetized or anything like that. Or they may actually be. I guess they are, but they go side to side. But then I will wrap the entire thing inside of a field set. And the reason I do that is because field sets are for grouping elements, grouping form controls that are related to one another in a particular way. And then to provide a label for that entire group, we use the legend element. Okay? The legend element traditionally, like if you start looking way back in the early days of the web, the legend element was extremely difficult to style. It still has some peculiarities, but IE for some reason used to put it in blue text. No idea why. Even the IE developers didn't know why. So it's kind of funny. But anyway, the legend element is a way to describe the contents of the field set. Okay? And then I would emphasize 8 available because I think that that's an important piece of this as well. And then together.
Tablets, 8 available. List with 8 items. ASUS Nexus 7. Checkbox not checked. List item. Checked. Barnes & Noble Book Color. BlackBerry Playbook. Checked. DataWine Dell Streak 7. Checkbox not checked. List item. Checked. Kindle Fire. Checked. Checked. Microsoft Surface RT. Checked. Samsung Galaxy Tab 10. Checkbox not checked. List item.
Surprisingly, that's actually slow for somebody who would use a screen reader. I sped it up so this talk wouldn't take forever, but that's actually slow for a lot of people. If you ever actually watch somebody use a screen reader, it's far faster than that. It's really amazing that somebody can actually process and comprehend at that speed, but they do. Do you have a Kindle Fire? Yeah. All right. So as you can see, this becomes a very usable construct for somebody who is using assistive technology, in addition to being fairly easy for us to use because we can click on any of those labels and it will check or uncheck the checkbox for us. And this is simple, right? That's pretty stupid simple markup and a repeatable pattern that you can use all over the place. Now I mentioned that legends occasionally have some peculiarities to them. Mostly they're with respect to like margin and padding. But you can override most of that stuff if you put let's say a B or a span or something like that around the text, some sort of more arbitrary, less semantic element around the text inside of the legend, then you can style that and ignore the legend pretty much entirely. So you can even use that to position the legend to the side if you were doing a side-by-side layout or something like that, which is pretty cool. All right, so then that whole thing would get put inside of a container in the overall list of the form. In this case, I use a consistent grouped type for any sort of grouped radios or checkboxes or what have you. So grouped, and then a second class of checkboxes to tell me that this is a checkbox group. Again, if you were using BEM, you'd probably use a slightly different approach. All right, that one makes sense to everybody? Let's deal with a little bit more grouping. So here we have two fields that are related to one another that are sort of part of the same construct, right? So related entries. In this case, again, from the reservation form, we have a date picker and we have a time picker. And in this case, we've used select elements, and we did that because we wanted to really fine-grain control the contents that somebody could enter in those fields. Because there are only certain days that we have our office open and certain days we want to entertain people coming into the device lab. So in that instance, we take our select from earlier, right? Here we have the select and label that we've seen before. And then we wrap that inside of a field set with a legend, right? We wrap that with a field set with a legend that says requested day and time. And then we have labels not actually visible here, right? So we do that, well, I wrap the whole thing in a date time select. This is another grouped field type. But we do that by excessively hiding those labels. So when somebody focuses on the field, the label can still be read out to them. If you use display none, it will be ignored. Visibility hidden, it'll be ignored. So you need to hide it in a way that is available to somebody using assistive technology. Now this way does absolute positioning and basically truncates it to being a pixel by a pixel and then clips it. So it's completely invisible. This works right to left or left to right, which is one of the benefits over the strategy I used to use, which was a negative left margin that went like negative 999 EMs or something like that. But this makes sure that it's still available to users. Everybody follow that one pretty well? All right, so let's take it a step further. And here we have actually separate date pickers, because sometimes you run into this. Somebody doesn't want the calendar picker. They just want to have multiple selects, right? So select a date. Here we would have, again, that same label select pattern being used repeatedly. And they are grouped year, month, day selects, given that class, as well as being a grouped field type. And then we've got our legends and labels. We're using the same strategy to hide the labels from the screen. But in this case, the labels are month, day, year, which don't really tell somebody when they're focusing on the field much about what the content is that's being asked for. We want them to select a date, the month for it. Select a date, day, select a date, year. That's what we want read out. So,
month, January, MO Box 1 of 12. Day, 1, MO Box 1 of 31. Year, 1990, MO Box 1 of 10.
So if we just left the markup as this is what we would get. Okay, so we don't get that selected date actually read out to us. If, however, we use the Aria labeled by that we looked at earlier, we can use that to actually associate the legend, which has an ID of select date, and the label for the month, which has month label as its ID, and then we can put both of those separated by spaces inside of the labeled by, the Aria labeled by attribute, and then it will all be read out to them.
Select a date month. Select a date day. Select a date year.
That's pretty awesome. We've completely controlled how that is read out to somebody using assistive technology. And it's still super usable to somebody who's, sighted. All right, this is the one that people dread, the table. Right? If you've ever had to do like rating systems and stuff like that, this is terribly annoying, especially if you do want to try and make it accessible, because tables have some accessibility stuff built into them with scopes for table headers, but how does that mix with the form? We don't know. In some devices it might do one thing, in some screen readers it might do another. How can we, predictably handle these in our markup? So in this case, the question that's being answered in the rating system is how would you rate your experience with foobar title from initial contact to closing? And then the options are from poor to excellent, right? So values of 1 through 5. So we have our input, which is a type of radio down there, and then we have poor. If we were to assign an ID to the table header for poor, we can use labeled by to associate the two of them so that when somebody focuses on that radio button, it'll actually say poor. So they know what they're getting when they select that. And then we can even do, for one particular radio, you may not want to do it for all of them if they're really long sentences because it would be read out each time. But you can put an ID on the row header, which is the how would you rate your experience. We can add an ID to that and then add that to the labeled by attribute. Okay. Now, if you are doing ratings, you probably don't want to direct somebody immediately to rating everything as poor, you know, just from a marketing standpoint. You want them to have to choose that. So maybe we do something in the middle, we do good. So still, each of the inputs is associated with the appropriate table header using Aria labeled by, but the experience piece, the question, and the one that you're focusing on initially is the middle value of good, right? So when we do that, this is what we end up with.
How would you rate your experience with foobar title from initial contact to closing? Good. Radio. Fair. Radio button selected. Poor. Radio button selected. Fair. Great. Radio button selected. Excellent. Radio button selected.
So that's pretty nice, right? With just a little bit of markup, a few IDs, and a labeled by. It's pretty awesome stuff. Mainly what we want to do when we're looking at forms is just think about how we want them to be read. And how can we make that as good an experience as possible? How can we make them natural? How can we make them simple for our users? Because the more we do that, the easier it is for them to fill out, whether they're cited, not cited, using a mobile device, what have you, right? We're just making it easy for them. And you can't always make the interface perfect. So in that case, you know, in the case of the table, you know, maybe you'd want to have the question read out if they, you know, paused for a moment, or, you know, there are certain instances maybe they leave that radio grouping and then they come back to it again. You may want to read it out. So, you know, from a markup standpoint, you couldn't do that purely in HTML because you couldn't know which one they're coming back to and dynamically change that just with HTML. You might decide that it's worth putting a little bit of JavaScript to have that experience piece follow whichever thing is currently checked, or you might decide it's, you know, a bit of extra effort and maybe we don't want to do it, but we'll have it set for the initial setup. So some of that is kind of up for debate how you want to handle it, but you could use JavaScript to enhance the experience even further by manipulating the Aria labeled by attributes on those fields. So let's deal with small screens a little bit. I kind of touched on that with some of the virtual keyboard stuff. But let's talk a little bit about some of the specific controls that we've looked at here. So here we have our confirmation checkbox, right? There's a nifty trick that we can use by adding a negative margin and then padding equal to that, top and bottom, to actually make a larger click area. So this is really handy when we want to make it really, really easy for our fat meat sticks. No, I'm not calling your fingers fat, mine are fat. To make them, you know, really easy for somebody to be able to go ahead and tap on those rather than having to try and click just on the radio or the checkbox. So that's pretty nice. And instead of doing side-by-side layouts by default, instead we should be thinking linearly in a single column in a mobile-first way, right? And so that should be our default setup to have our labels be displayed block. And then inside of a media query, when we know we have enough room to display those side by side with the fields, if we do want to pursue that, we can do that. Your media queries may vary. You know, 60Ms may work for this site. It may not work for yours. It might be 48.32 or something like that. Get your own damn media queries, to quote Matt Marquis. So same thing goes when you dive into things like this. In the case of the sign-up form on the Open Device Lab, we have all of these listed out linearly on small screens, and then when we have enough real estate, then we display them side by side. The side-by-side label input thing that we saw on this previous one may not be the best approach nowadays, because if somebody's using something like a larger tablet, maybe they're using a full-size iPad or they're using a Microsoft Surface, and it zooms into the field, the user may no longer have the label in their visual range. So in that case, it might be best to just stick to having the labels on top and maybe just having a maximum width on the fields, because obviously you don't want a field that's like that, ridiculously long, right? So truncating them at a certain point, but having the labels on top just so it's consistently easy for somebody to look at. All right, so all that makes sense to everybody? You want to talk about validation a little bit? Everybody needs a little validation. So I mentioned earlier that we have the required attribute for fields, which allows us to indicate to the browser that we want this field to be filled out in order for the browser in order for the browser to allow the form to be submitted. Now, from a content standpoint, we want to notify users that a field is required, right? We want to make it obvious to them. So the traditional approach had been to do something like fields marked with an asterisk are required, and then we'd mark them with an asterisk. And maybe if we thought we were being really good, we'd use an abbreviation element to explain that the asterisk was actually meant required. So an abbreviation element with a title of required, thinking that maybe that title would be read out. Reality, no.
First name asterisk. Edit text.
Nope. First name asterisk. Damn it. All right, got to make it better. So we could improve things by maybe using the Aria labeled by, which we know about, right? So we could apply that to the abbreviation to make sure that assistive technology that's Aria aware at least reads out that that's required. And in this case, the Aria labeled by is required, which is an ID reference to the strong element, which is wrapped around required inside of that paragraph. So unfortunately, this isn't really a great experience either.
Fields marked with asterisk are required. First name required. First name required. First name required. Edit text.
Do you think the first name's required? Could be. Could be. All right, so that's no good. Well, what if we made sure, using Tabindex, we can make sure that that paragraph is focused before somebody is able to focus the form. So by assigning tab index of 0, we can put any element into the tab flow of a page. Traditionally, it's just links and form fields. But tab index 0 is the special one that adds any element into the tab flow. So this ensures that somebody comes to that fields marked with an asterisk are required. So that's good. And then we can apply an Aria required attribute to the field. Now, Aria and HTML5 were being developed basically at the same time. And in many cases, they were trying to solve the same problems. So there's some redundancy between them. You see this in a lot of the Aria roles as well, between HTML5 elements and the Aria roles that are available. There's a lot of like navigation and nav, that sort of stuff. So Aria required really is kind of doubling up on what the required attribute should do. But a lot of assistive technology was tracking the Aria spec and wasn't tracking what the WhatWG was doing in terms of the HTML5 spec. But if we use Aria required, we can make sure that that actually gets read out as required.
Fields marked with asterisk are required. First name asterisk. Edit text required.
Solved. Nice, huh? Pretty simple. Simple stuff. All right, I promise we're almost done. You heard the clapping in the other room, but I'm going to take you just a little bit longer over your break because this is really good stuff. So again, it comes back to focusing on making the entire experience a good reading experience, which in turn makes it a good user experience. I mentioned browsers support native validation now. Most of the modern ones do. So we have email validation. We can use the pattern attribute to enforce pattern validation using regular expressions, which if you're a back-end developer like I am as well, you can actually pipe the regular expressions you would use to validate on the back end into the markup and just maintain it all in one spot, which is pretty sweet. And we can use the placeholder together with pattern if you're asking for a really complex pattern. So here's how that would work. I'm going to enter the incorrect information first, and you'll see that it'll throw up a message. So please match the requested format. And then if I wipe it out, it will actually put in the right value. and then it'll let me move on to the next field. So most browsers that implement this will actually block at the individual field level rather than making you go to the end of the form and then fill it out. So we can customize the error messages that are thrown up using JavaScript. There's an API for setting the custom validity of a field. There is a way to use the title attribute to push information into it as well, but I don't recommend it because titles get read out by assistive tech, so don't do that. But here's an example of my custom message being put in there, which is pretty neat. Because we needed to do this, we wrote a little JavaScript plugin library that basically ports HTML5 validation to older browsers, but also allows you to do the custom error messages using data attributes. And that's up on GitHub if you want to use it. It's stupid simple, because I like stupid simple declarative things. You can simply say on a field, here is the data validation error empty message, and here's the invalid message. So 2 different messages you could provide for any field. You could also bubble this up to the form level and set default messages on the form as a whole, and then do specific messages on an individual field. So it makes it a little bit easier to manage all of this stuff. You can pipe the content in from a CMS, which is pretty awesome, and again, maintain it all in one spot. And then finally, don't forget about the server-side validation stuff, because you can never trust the client. Users can easily go in and manipulate these attributes using an inspector, so you need to do validation on the back end, which means you need to be able to spit messages back from the back end. I highly recommend collecting all of the messages, all of the error messages, into one spot so that you can let a user know immediately. So in this case, we've got a div with a role of alert using the Aria role, and what this would do is actually alert the user as soon as they come to the page.
Contact retreats 4 geeks. There were errors with your form submission. 1. Message is a required field. 2. Name is a required field. 3. Email is a required field.
So as soon as the user comes in, they get that chime, and then they're immediately told what the errors are. Now the other added benefit of using this approach is that you can list out those fields that have errors, and each of those can contain a link directly to the field that has an error just using your ID references. They become the anchor points to jump down. So that's pretty handy. Okay. And then when we get to the field level, you want to provide context when a user focuses on the field as to what the actual error is so that they get that information. So we can set the field as being invalid using aria invalid equals true, and then we can use the described by pattern that we used for notes to actually associate the error message. So in this case, described by email-error. And then we have your email address is required, is the validation error message given. We can style that in a particular way. Maybe visually we want to insert an X before it. We can use the speak none in the future to tell assistive technology not to read that X. But what we end up with is
email asterisk. Edit text invalid and when required. Your email address is required.
Which is a pretty good experience for assistive technology, as well as being a pretty good visual indicator and textual context for what the error is on a given field. Okay, so that was a lot of information to take in a very short amount of time, but hopefully you guys have moved from thinking that, yeah, forms suck, to, yes, they can suck a lot less. And hopefully you've realized that forms can be easy to build, they can be predictable, they can be effortless for users to use, and they can be accessible. Thank you all very much.